Hello, everybody. I want to thank Phil Wolfson for inviting me to give this talk. This subject is dear to my heart, and I am going to share slides as I talk and see if I can pull this off all by myself. Strange to give a talk with an audience of one, just listening to yourself, but see how this goes. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to talk today about the neurobiology of ketamine and what it says as to the control over consciousness and the control over scope of consciousness, range of consciousness, and how understanding that can give us a sense of how Jung's theories about the distinction between self and ego really are supported, and how to use that distinction in therapy with patients in order to leverage the ketamine experience, the transcendent experience or psychedelic experience of ketamine in your work with them in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So let's see. Full disclosures, I'm the Chief Science Officer for Becker Biomedical, and we are developing NMDA receptor strategies and repurposing ketamine for pain management. Also Chief Science Officer of Iris Nutraceuticals, where we've been working on developing NMDA receptor support for psychosis with natural molecules, and medical advisor for Neurohacker Collective. Regarding ketamine treatment, just to give you a little bit of background about my treatment patterns, I have used it for many years, and I generally think of it as a very useful tool in the treatment-resistant depression, suicidal ideation, long-standing kind of existential despair, transitional life crises where somebody may have lost a loved one, or they've lost their job and they're heading into actual depression, kind of complicated grief situations. I think PTSD, it can be very helpful, complex trauma. I generally have used it in intramuscular delivery, 0.3 milligrams to 1 milligram per kilogram, as a single bolus, or very often actually divided in 3 doses spaced by somewhere between 8 to 15 minutes, depending on the person. Cardiac and pulmonary assessment ahead of time and monitoring, and physical presence throughout. I treat the patient directly and work with them for 2 hours plus for each treatment. I do use propranolol, clonidine, ondansetron, and generally in years and years of use, I've seen mild bumps in blood pressure, definitely seen some nausea, dizziness, and things like that, all relatively manageable. I also do a functional intake, and so that's a little bit of background on me. I believe that we should be looking at people's physicality as well, and metabolism as well, in order to support those factors as we are looking at consciousness medicine, in order to give people the best chance to make use of the insights that they get in this kind of new mode. So I won't go too deeply into this, but this is also another passion of mine. Generally, when I describe the 3 dosing strategy, I would just give you a bit of background as to my reasoning. What I've found over the years is that the therapeutic aspect of ketamine can very much be lost when the experience is so deep and for so long with a single dose that people go in, and then when they come out, they don't really remember a lot of the material that came up. And I think that the material can be very helpful in producing insight and helping them grow, helping them kind of rediscover themselves. And so I've, over the years, kind of learned how to use what we call hybrid dosing. We'll divide the target dose into 3 different boluses. IM delivery, usually in the deltoid, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4/9, 3/9, 2/9, as far as the dosing strategy to get them kind of the last dose, allow them to kind of return to ground and kind of collect themselves and be able to leave the office in a reasonable amount of time. But what's very nice about this is people can kind of get into the liminal state where they are transitioning, experiencing the deep self, still maybe a foot in the real world, and awareness of who they are, but there's this kind of roiling interaction between these 2 aspects of self. And when they come back out, I will often kind of interact with the patient for a minute or two, maybe pull a little bit of the material out, what kind of imagery they were experiencing, what kind of themes, was there some kind of overarching quality to the experience, and then they go back in for the second dose and then the third dose. And this creates kind of a triptych kind of model, I think. And what's interesting is that the mining of the material in these phases right here can be very useful for reconstructing the experience for the patient. Often when we're in discussion, at the end of it, I'll ask them a little bit of information about some of the imagery that they brought up or the symbolism that they brought up when we talked here. And they will often say, oh, wow, you know, I didn't remember that. I had forgotten that part of it. And I think that that can be very useful. And what's interesting is a lot of times you will see a progression of symbolism through the three different experiences. So I think that if you look at ketamine's benefits for humans in this kind of consciousness model, consciousness medicine space, I think at a very simple level, it helps us remember who we are. And I always really appreciated this kind of koan from when I studied mysticism in undergrad, that that humans are the only animal that forgets what they are. We're the only mental animal that forgets what it is. Something is lost in this transition into adulthood that kind of needs reclaiming. And that also the other aspect of ketamine is symbolic discovery. So I'll get it a little bit into the symbol, the nature of symbol versus sign, but that a lot of us, until we, you know, maybe have a consciousness expanding event, however that happens, or through hard work or sometimes through psychedelics, will interact more with a constricted, more derivative version of what symbolic knowledge kind of is, more what we call sign than symbol in our everyday life, and can sometimes feel estranged from the sources of meaning that symbol can provide to us. That in the space, there is very commonly a resolution of paradox. The experience of being ceases to be seen as either or, right or wrong, good or bad, and becomes kind of both and, both this and that. And, you know, that is a very wonderful experience for many people to experience directly. And then at the highest level, a lot of times people will have an experience with encounter with self. And often the encounter with the self is described at some level as an experience or encounter with God. And this is an old theme that the deep self, when it's directly interacting with the ego, can be experienced as a deity or an outside wise entity that one would attribute to God. So whether it's God or not, I do not have any take on it other than that it feels divine. So there's a process in development in the kind of Jungian archetype of what is happening to us. It's very interesting. And that is that the ego has to emerge from the wider, broader well of self and become both independent and yet in communication with the self. In a perfect world, we would have this kind of a diagram where the ego and, you know, the daily aspects of ourself that make decisions and, you know, push us towards making sometimes difficult decisions and doing things that require diligence and stick-to-itiveness and doing things when we don't want to do them, and a lot of the nitty-gritty, the kind of grind of life. But that there would be communication from the deep self. From the deep self would come sources of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, kind of the North Star that can allow the ego to feel like there's some kind of story unfolding that they're experiencing and engaging with. And when that line gets broken in Jungian kind of modeling that as an estranged state. It's often a depressed state. It can even become kind of a quasi-psychotic state in certain ways. So what is interesting is that I did a lot of work trying to understand how to bring some of these ideas that I just described with Jung and understand and possibly map them onto the neurobiology of control over consciousness and see whether there's an actual model that kind of fits, yes, on kind of almost like a logic board kind of model instead. But does this stuff map? Is there fidelity across these different models in neurobiology, in psychiatry, psychology, Jungian psychology, religious paradigms? And I feel very much that that is the case, actually. If you look at the kind of primary chain of evidence that I'm going to kind of lay out in this next slide, these next slides, there's this primary connection to our core being that seems to be kind of lost in adolescence. And that process looks very much like it is driven by a GABAergic interneuron control over thought, a very powerful increase in inhibitory tone through these neurons that kind of control pyramidal cells and control what they're allowed to think and how they're allowed to interact with each other. We need this to happen. If this does not happen, we don't become effective adults that can problem solve and do difficult things. But at the same time, there does seem to be some kind of bargain in which we give up a sense of largeness or possibility or the kind of feeling of anything is possible. And there's this very common theme in religious studies and in kind of Western culture and Western myth that something is lost, and if it is not regained, then spiritual despair and depression often result. And that is a lot of where the kind of hero's journey comes from, this idea that you have to rediscover your power, your identity, and then fully become who you are. That when you're young, you know who you are, and then you get lost, and then you find yourself again. Ketamine blocks those pyramidal cells, blocks the pyramidal cell inhibition by GABAergic neurons, and I'm going to show you how that works. And in a way, what happens, the way you can think of this is that it inhibits the inhibitor. So if there's this inhibitory tone that's controlling thought, ketamine can go in. It looks like it can almost preferentially, at the kind of doses we're talking about for use in depression, that bring on the dissociative or psychedelic effect, and inhibits the cells that inhibit other neurons, primarily what we're talking about, your pyramidal cells, and very specifically do that. And the release of this inhibitory tone allows the pyramidal cells to express themselves in a much wider array of potential and interactions with each other, and that there is this kind of flow that happens. And I think it's very easy in some ways to see this, that awareness shifts in this inhibiting of the inhibitor, and awareness shifts from ego to self, and that what one is not to what one is. And I say that very specifically. I know it's kind of a strange kind of logic problem, but if you think about what is being the C-plane of what's possible in terms of full conscious range, being whittled down by this inhibitory tone to some kind of stable range of consciousness that fluxes through our everyday experience with the world and interaction with the world, what this might be conceived of as what you're not, the things that are not. So it's the things that it's what you might say it is what is, but it is this reduction from what is to what's not. So once that's lifted off, a lot of people will describe when they come out of a ketamine experience that they feel like they found out what they are. You know, they understood what they are, and it's a very, very specific way of talking about an understanding of their being being larger and more complex and richer than they realized. I would also basically make the argument here that this maps very nicely onto transcendence as described in mysticism. I'll get into that in some later slides. And that also this experience can be seen as a specific realignment of the ego-self axis, a Jungian concept that is involved in kind of psychic healing, where the ego re-engages or is reinfused with communication from the deep self, and that communication hopefully gets to be kept when they go back out in the world, and their intuitive function, the deeper sources of meaning become available to them. I was deeply interested in answering a very specific question, which is how could such a simple non-competitive antagonist acting at a very common receptor, the NMDA receptor, so rapidly produce a transcendent or mystical state in human beings? It's really quite astounding that something can be given that can enact such rapid shift and then leave so quickly as well. And I feel that this very specifically tells us a lot about the mechanisms that stabilize default consciousness, and can tell us a lot about, what is it that constricts our consciousness into this smaller range. If you look at development in human beings, what's very interesting is that somewhere between kind of 7 to 20, you see this very large increase in what we call GABAergic receptor densities. There's this very, very sharp increase in inhibitory receptors on pyramidal cell neurons that are basically can be used to control those neurons and control the thinking. And you see also in the process this increase in what we call PV parvalbumin cells, and these are cells that are inhibitory and what we call fast spiking, meaning that they can act very quickly and fire rapidly and repeatedly in the process of kind of controlling thinking, kind of in the in a fast way rather than kind of more of a slow burn. And we see also an increase in what we call EEG gamma band spectral power, and in kind of the same frame. And it's a little bit complicated to explain, but gamma band power is felt to be in some ways probably a proxy for GABAergic interneuron net activity and local activities that are kind of controlling thought and creating kind of a higher level of consciousness or a higher moment of conscious perception. And so we have a fair amount of evidence pointing again in this direction, just when you look at receptor densities in brains that are at different ages. When I was talking about this inhibitory net, I would explain a little bit more because it's really quite interesting. There's a cell called the chandelier cell, and it's inhibitory, and it's in this image it's the green cell here. This cell here is a pyramid cell, and we have just a whole bunch of pyramid cells. I mean, these are basically the vast majority of what we would call kind of thinking at some level. This is ultra simplistic, but it holds up a bit. Would be the interaction of pyramid cells with each other, that when they are firing and they're causing other neurons to fire, or other pyramid cells to fire, and they're going back and forth, that kind of electric kind of interaction you might call thinking. And control over thinking at some basic level looks like it can be substantially achieved by a certain set of neurons called chandelier cells. Chandelier cells, they were also called axo-axonic cells. And the reason they were called that, axo-axonic, is because they're axons, synapse, on the axon of the pyramid cell. Now that is a very strange arrangement, and it's actually quite novel, in fact, unique. And when they found this was such a shock that a lot of people didn't really think this was real. Normally axons synapse upon dendrites. So if you look at this pyramid cell, you'll see the dendrites are kind of like the antenna out there taking in information. That information comes into the neuron, and then the neuron, when it gets the right set of stimuli, it will sometimes send its signal on, and it will send information down its axon, which would be this here. So here is the antenna collecting information coming into the cell body, and then here is the axon. Well, here you have a chandelier cell that's inhibitory, and it can come in and actually turn off the pyramid cell right at its neck, right at its throat. So the early axon segment, we call it, of the pyramid cell is the location for synapse from the chandelier cell. And it is such a specific arrangement that it is felt that one chandelier cell can kind of maintain a stranglehold over possibly 300 pyramidal cells. And what is also interesting is that chandelier cells will communicate with each other, and they will basically coordinate their activity in terms of controlling certain stereotypes of thought. So certain thoughts and modes of thinking maybe are not available when these things are firing in their stereotyped ways. We also have a different cell called the basket cell, and that's a very interesting thing. I won't get into that today. There's a whole interesting aspect to the basket cell, but it is also a fast spiking cell. It actually synapses on the body of the pyramid cell. It does not have this interesting arrangement, which is again like this kind of stranglehold on the early axon segment of the pyramid cell. So what we know is currently is that in the awake rat cortex, and we use rats for this kind of stuff because it's hard to do studies in humans in this way, but the NMDA receptors preferably regulate the firing rate of cortical GABAergic interneurons. And what they mean by that is, again, these chandelier cells and possibly the basket cells. The impact of NMDA receptor inhibition on pyramidal neuron activity was profoundly excitatory. And what that means is that when ketamine is given and should be inhibiting NMDA receptors, it should turn down pyramidal cell activity if that's where it's acting. But for some reason, when ketamine is given, pyramidal cells become more excited. And that is because, again, this inhibitory tone is released because ketamine preferably goes to these inhibitory neurons. And that has to do a lot with the type of receptors that they have. It's too complicated for this talk, but we do think we know to a fair extent why that is the case. Let's see. So this basically suggests that this effect is indirect and is caused by disinhibition of GABAergic neurons that control the firing of pyramidal cells, GABAergic neurons, again, being inhibitory. And it has to do with the fact that these cells live at a more depolarized state. It's kind of like they're always kind of on a little bit. They fire and then they're kind of like waiting, and they fire, they easily fire. Is kind of one way to think about it. And when they're in that depolarized state, when they're kind of ready, hunched, ready to go, they open themselves up to ketamine getting onto their receptors and turning them off, which is really quite interesting. So this statement says a lot, and I just bear with me to just read it here. This more depolarized state of GABAergic interneurons would dictate that more NMDA receptor channels, which are voltage gated, are open. When the system is exposed to an NMDA antagonist, there is a preferential effect on inhibiting GABAergic neurons compared with pyramidal neurons, producing a decrease in the firing rate of GABAergic neurons that in turn enhances the firing rate of pyramidal neurons. So this sounds almost too easy to understand after you struggle with this. I know this is complicated, but it's kind of like, wow, is this for real? Is this really how simple it is, really, in some ways, that there's control over consciousness like this? What we know is that when ketamine is given, there is this release of inhibitory tone. Neurons are able to talk to each other that have not necessarily been able to talk, and there are new dendritic connections made and densities. And this is what we see in imaging before and after a ketamine infusion. You can see the growth in connectivity. Those little dots and those red arrows are dendritic spines that are present after ketamine that were not present before. And this is where the antidepressant effect and kind of the change that can come over people over the weeks after treatment probably comes from, is this, when neurons are able to communicate with each other, they kind of are then able to do it more easily in the future. What we know is that when ketamine is given, we see an increase in certain areas of the brain that are involved in what we might call ego. It's a bit of an overstatement, but it's called the default mode network. Some people would argue, definitely there's nuance here, and I'm not arguing that that's exactly the same thing as ego, but at some level, there is, it's reasonable, at least partly to use it in this way. Use this concept in this way. What we see is that the nodes of the default mode network that are involved in interacting with each other to kind of control the set point of our default mode, especially the hippocampal location, hippocampus, increase in activity, but what happens is they decrease in their interactions with the other nodes. So if they're increasing their activity and yet they're decreasing in their specific and normally stereotyped interactions with specific areas of the brain, it seems that one can pretty much intuit that they're getting more input from other areas and they're giving out more input to other areas. And so there's more of a global interaction throughout the brain. And that's pretty much what we see on fMRI. What we see is that this is called an anti-correlation map of the default mode network, and you can see that certain areas were correlated with each other. So these areas, these are nodes in the default mode network, were normally communicating with each other more. And what you see under light ketamine sedation is that all of a sudden they're not really communicating with each other, which is interesting. It's kind of like a suspension of kind of normal kind of consciousness control when people are in the actual ketamine state. When they come out of the ketamine state, what you see is a kind of normalization. I'm actually going to skip that. Actually, this is another one where you can see a decrease in correlation. This is before ketamine and this is after ketamine. You can see that the redder the color, the hotter the color, the more kind of connected the nodes were when they did the global connectivity study and fMRI. And what they showed was in light ketamine sedation, you reduce that interaction. And the interactions, what we find is that in highly creative people that actually, just have more connections between the different nodes, and they also have more connections, it looks, to areas that are maybe not normally associated with those nodes. And this is so powerful that it actually can predict an individual's creative thinking ability, to see how connected these different nodes are. If people have ultra kind of clamped down stereotyped interactions versus kind of a little looser and more interaction between different nodes, and not just the nodes that are in the default mode network, but other areas of the brain, you can see a more a kind of creative brain. So this is an example of people with depression and the interactions of, it's a little complicated how to explain this. This is a correlation of prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, and a very important part of the default mode network, with other areas of the brain that are in the default mode network. And what you see is that during depression, certain areas of the default mode network will be actually, in reality, they'll be more active and more interacting with each other, but they will not necessarily be in connection with the areas that they should be. And these are the areas that are, this is more high correlation. And what you see is after a ketamine experience, the people who were depressed return to a much more normal interaction in their brain, actually. This was only 24 hours after the previous scans and compared to controls, the red bars, they look much more normalized compared to where they were before. So the areas of the brain and the ways that they would normally be talking to each other return to somebody after ketamine who was depressed, and probably, I don't actually remember if this was correlated to response, but one might posit that this kind of change would be correlated to the actual response to ketamine as an antidepressant. I'm going to give you one more piece to kind of round out all the big story here. We have a lot of different waveforms in our brain, and when they do EEG, they can see these kind of high frequencies, mid frequencies, and very low frequencies. Theta waves are a kind of 4 to 8 hertz, and that's basically beats per second. So 4 hertz would be wah 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 wah, that kind of thing. Alpha wave 8 to 12, beta is 13 to 30, and then we have gamma. And we have gamma, and gamma is anywhere from kind of 30 to 120. I've even seen things, measurements much higher than that. And we believe, again, that this gamma wave activity, when it's perceived, when it's measured in certain areas of the brain, may very much signify kind of a conscious moment. And it's interesting, Wikipedia kind of talks about this. I thought they did a really good job of explaining it very succinctly, and I thought, I'm just going to pull that. The gamma wave is a pattern of neural oscillation in humans with a frequency between 25 and 100 hertz, 100 frequencies per second, 100 squiggles per second, with 40 hertz being typical. And that gamma waves may be implicated in creating unity of conscious perception. And what they kind of mean by that is that when there's this kind of pulling together from multiple areas that something is significant and association of meaning, that there may be a kind of a gamma wave burst, that there's the gamma wave kind of activity is kind of showing that, hey, this is very important, and that might very much be considered a moment of conscious perception. And when all these neuronal clusters oscillate together, they help bring a distributed matrix of cognitive processes together to generate a coherent and concerted cognitive act, such as perception. So it really describes a lot of what we consider to be the highest level of kind of what humans are in terms of our consciousness, what kind of separates us maybe from animals, or at least, you know, as a continuum. We're at the end of a continuum in terms of having this quality. And what you see with ketamine is that all of those waveforms, again, the delta, theta, alpha, and beta waveforms, which are kind of involved in kind of different processes in the brain and mind, but that all of those different processes seem to go down during an actual ketamine experience acutely. While the ketamine is in the human being, you see a decrease in delta, a decrease in theta, you see a decrease in alpha and beta. And this decrease that you see is all specifically in nodes of the default mode network. And what you see instead is a very significant increase in gamma wave activity. You see these frequencies come up, and you see it happening kind of in a global fashion. You see this increase in gamma wave activity to some extent throughout the whole brain. So much so that if you did a color analysis on the brain here, you'll see that kind of at baseline, the delta, this is a measurement of like basically power, kind of the electrical power in this frequency. And you'll see that delta goes down significantly. Cooler colors mean there's less power. There's just less of those waves happening in any given second. Theta gets cooler, alpha gets cooler, and beta gets cooler. Gamma gets warmer, and this is a little bit hard to see, but this is actually fairly significant. If you look at the color difference between here, you see definitely redder and yellower back here, and all of this is actually warmer throughout the whole brain. Very interesting. If you think about how that might happen, think about if this chandelier cell, remember that cell I was telling you about, which is controlling so many neurons, all of these little green spikes here. These are initial axon segment synapses with inhibitory kind of control over neurons. You can see this one cell. Some of these may be from neighboring cells, but it gets the point across and why they called it a chandelier cell, because it branches out and it has all of these kind of dripping fingers going out and controlling neurons around it. If you think about that neuron kind of turning off a little bit and thinking about all the other red neurons being allowed all of a sudden to not be inhibited, it could make sense how a spreading sense of meaning and connection across areas of the brain might happen. I'll give you just a quick diagram to show you with the chandelier cell. Again, it basically has to turn off completely in order for pyramid cells to fire. So when the chandelier cell is firing, okay, you don't get the pyramid cell firing at all. And when the chandelier cell finally turns off, then all of a sudden the pyramid cell can work. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about most systems have to live in a kind of relationship of push and pull, back and forth, winter, summer, dark and light. We've got the nature of the universe seems to be in wave forms, and it's often the case that you have two opposing forces that are working back and forth and back and forth. And it's very much what you see in the dance relationship between the pyramidal cell and the chandelier cell. You'll see that the basket cell is not the same in this sense. You know, the basket cell is actually fires almost directly after the pyramid cell fires. So it's involved in a whole nother thing I'm not going to get into in this talk, but it's really quite interesting. So in short, to give you another diagram, so to make the point, you have these chandelier cells that maintain control over pyramidal cells with GABAergic input. GABA being a neurotransmitter, again, that allows chloride to rush into the cell and kind of calms the cell down, makes it harder for that cell to fire. And pyramidal cells, in turn, actually can stimulate chandelier cells with glutamate, NMDA receptor stimulated glutamate that attaches to NMDA receptors on these chandelier cells. Well, remember how those chandelier cells were kind of living at this excitatory tone that's a little bit higher than the pyramidal cell, and that kind of opens up their receptors, and that allows the ketamine to go in. Ketamine can get onto these receptors, and what you end up seeing is that this connection comes down in strength. And I'll give you a picture of that. So when the ketamine gets on board, then all of a sudden the chandelier cell activity normally to control the pyramidal cell goes away, and what you get is this increase in pyramidal cell activity. I think that this represents a decrease in ego tone. Is one way to think about it in kind of this psychological, some of the psychological paradigms. And what's interesting is that that is not the way that the standard psychedelics work, the classical psychedelics, the 5-HT2A, serotonin, serotonergic psychedelics. If this is the normal model that we have here, the standard psychedelics seem to stimulate the pyramidal cells directly, actually through 5-HT2A receptors that are on the cell body of the pyramidal cell and on kind of the proximal dendrite, that kind of the dendrite areas that are just kind of right outside the cell body, and directly stimulate the pyramidal cell through those receptors. But what you have not done is reduced the inhibitory tone necessarily. And so what you have in that circumstance is that instead of increasing flow or information, or flow, you can think of maybe like almost like a stream, by just kind of opening up the aperture and allowing more water to go through. Instead, what you have instead is that you have the same aperture, but you put more pressure behind. And I think that that's partly why sometimes the psychedelics can feel overwhelming, and why the ego feels so much more intact in the experience. The ego has to kind of submit or kind of give in or accept all this extra information that normally it would be trying to control. So these are the two models that we have with the classical psychedelics being I think represent kind of increased self-tone with ego tone left intact, possibly even enhanced in certain circumstances if the anxiety comes up, if the person's sad or the setting's wrong, or they just haven't done some preparation and all that, having trouble letting go. Whereas ketamine represents more of a direct, just decrease in ego tone that allows self to be kind of to flow more easily, kind of increased signal resulting from increased aperture, versus the psychedelics where it's increased signal pushed through the same size aperture. So as more of a increasing the pressure. So, I think it's interesting if you look at the descriptions of psychedelics from early descriptions, and I think a lot of people who've had these experiences themselves, they can see this stuff in this that reminds them of moments in their own experiences. That visionary experience. This is Aldous Huxley talking about mescaline, and which is a 5-HT2A agonist and kind of classical psychedelic. That visionary experience is not always blissful. It is sometimes terrible. There is hell as well as heaven. Like heaven, the visionary hell has its preternatural light and its preternatural significance, but the significance is intrinsically appalling, and the light is the smoky light of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the darkness visible of Milton. I think that there's a lot in that statement that can kind of be traced back to the actual neurobiology of the differences between these psychedelics. And if you contrast this statement with James's statement describing his experience with nitrous oxide, which is a very clear NMDA receptor antagonist. It gets very quickly onto the receptors in the way, the same receptors that ketamine does, and creates this kind of dissociative psychedelic experience. His description, some years ago, I myself made some observations on this aspect of nitrous oxide in intoxication. It is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of sheens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. He's not being overtly positive about his experience, but there's definitely a difference in character in the way that he's describing it. And if you read the descriptions of nitrous oxide-induced ecstasy, transcendence, in his section in The Varieties of Religious Experience on mysticism, they are almost uniformly joyful. And the kind of dark light of Milton that Huxley is describing seems to be conspicuously absent in those descriptions. I think it's interesting. I want to explain something kind of quickly, but is really quite interesting, which is that the NMDA receptor is a long-acting receptor. When it opens, it's open for quite some time in kind of neuronal terms. It's open for upwards of 400 milliseconds, as opposed to the AMPA receptor, which can be more on the neighborhood of 10 milliseconds. And what that means is, in some ways, is that when this receptor opens up, it kind of brings us into time. It makes there be a distinction between not just that something is perceived, but that it was perceived. And the difference between something perceived and something was perceived is a kind of a profound concept if you think about it. What's interesting, one way to think about it is that when AMPA receptors open, these are also excitatory. They use glutamate. Glutamate is what excites them and turns them on, and it can excite a neuron and get it to fire. When AMPA currents are active, it's only for 2 to 10 milliseconds. But again, NMDA receptor currents are more like 100 to 400 milliseconds. And what that means is approaching about a half a second. And I'm going to show you something really quite interesting, which is, again, going back to James and the Varieties of Religious Experience. If you read that, there's this very interesting quote from a man named Zenos Clark, and he's describing what the anesthetic revelation is like, and why there is this humor in it and kind of wonderful mystery that is hard to kind of capture. And he says at the moment of recovery from anesthesia, just then, before starting on life, I catch a glimpse of the eternal process, just in the act of starting. We travel on a journey that was accomplished before we set out, and the real end of philosophy is when we remain in our destination, being already there. When we cease our intellectual reasoning, that is why there is a smile upon the face of the revelation as we view it. And then he says, it tells us that we are forever a half a second too late. Again, if you look at the NMDA receptor and how long it's open, it's just about a half a second. And it separates us in some ways and brings us into time separate from what is, and in some ways maybe always kind of perceiving what just was. Very interesting. Okay, so to get back to how to map this onto the actual experience, if you do accept some of what I've kind of laid out as a thesis, that there is this kind of encounter with self, that ego separates from self at some level, that estrangement of this interaction between the two can be a painful situation for people that might be associated with depression. Let me take it a step further and show you a few things. So I love this poem by Wordsworth, Odes on Intimations of Immortality. And really, I won't read the whole thing. It's a little bit dense here, but I would encourage you, if you're watching this, you might take a few minutes and just kind of read through this and read his description of what I was describing again, this loss of knowledge, this loss of connection, this loss of kind of pure being that we all go through in development, from childhood into early adolescence, the growing individuation that happens in early adulthood, and then often the despair of adulthood that sets in the later years. It's the themes that are in this are kind of ever present, especially in Western literature and Western myth. And you might almost think of it like something gets overlaid upon us that kind of separates us from our full consciousness. We need it, of course. We need this to allow us to hunt for nuts and berries and work hard and do things we don't want to, pay the mortgage, but it can be a painful state. And if you think about what I was showing you before about the growth of connectivity of these chandelier cells and control over the pyramidal cells in early adolescence, it starts to make sense that this will be something that we would actually experience directly in our experience of ourselves, our interactions with the world, how we see our place in the world, what we see as possible for ourselves. The ketamine state, really specifically mimics the mystical states, which are considered to be this transcendence. And what are we transcending when we use that word? We're talking about transcending the ego at a certain level. It's very difficult to describe. It's ineffable. It's noetic in the sense that there's this sense of kind of universal truth, great authority. It's transient. It comes and it goes. It's kind of a state of mind that is not really compatible with everyday activities and demands of everyday life. It's kind of passive in the sense it feels like it's happening to the person or to you instead of you doing it. There's a sense of oneness, a timelessness, and a transcendence. And all of those are considered to be the kind of key characteristics of a mystical state. If you look at Happold's very important book, characterizing the nature of mysticism and the mystic state of mind. And if you look at basically the Jungian kind of model, there's this idea that the connection between the ego and the self is so vitally important to psychic health that it provides foundation, structure, and security to the ego, and provides energy, interest, and meaning and purpose. And when that connection is broken, the result is emptiness, despair, meaninglessness, and in extreme cases, psychosis or suicide. I was saying this earlier. This is actually a direct quote from Edinger's book, Ego and Archetype, which I find an incredible book for understanding these kinds of concepts at a deep level. When a patient is in the ketamine state, one thing that I try to work with them is to help them understand what the nature, again, of symbol is, which is really image or representation of kind of archetypal forms that point to something kind of essentially unknown, kind of a mystery, but that we get to glimpse the mystery. We get to barely understand it, but kind of grasp it, even if only for moments, when we interact with symbol. In our everyday life, a lot of times what we are much more interacting with, which is sign, which is kind of a derivative, secondary kind of pointing towards symbol, as opposed to interacting with symbol directly. We create a lot of signs to point towards symbol. Symbols aren't created, they're found. If you kind of buy into the kind of Jungian archetype, that these things kind of almost exist in and of themselves, that beauty and love, that motherhood or motherness, mother in and of itself, and father, that these are things that are not things that we make up. We discover them because they exist in and of themselves. It's very interesting, and it's a very powerful concept, actually, and it gets sometimes people out of the self-referential leveling that can happen, where you know, all things are so relative that we can't ever say anything is real or not. Sometimes it can be very reassuring for patients to feel like these things are real, that they're not just making them up. It's not just psychosis or you know, just a trip, but that it was something that's kind of universal. And when you are using these symbols, it is a way of making the symbolic process conscious, because symbolic processes that occur in us are often subconscious. And if we don't have access to them, we don't have to have always fully conscious access, but if we are not at least kind of aware of them, a lot of times they can drive our behaviors with some kind of urgency towards external action, which may not actually be beneficial to us. It may be seen in kind of acting out, where the consciousness that might help in terms of the interaction with the symbol is missing, and things are being done and enacted in a much more unconscious way. So to see the symbolic image behind the symptom, a lot of times what they're going through, can immediately transform the experience. It can transform whatever the person is going through into a very different narrative for the person, and place it into the kind of hero's journey very clearly. These kinds of ideas, you know, are again laid all through Western literature and other cultures' literature, of course. But you know, you don't have to look far to see this. This is Houston Smith's mystic paradigm, where he really argues that we live at a nexus of space, time, and being being an actual dimension. That being is a dimension, and that dimension is as real as any other dimension. It's not something that we're just making up. It's something that we are living in, that actual dimension. And that what we all want, probably, if we were to really state things clearly, is to have more being. And if we were clearer about what we wanted in this way, we might be much more specific about our actions and our endeavors in the world. And if you take these concepts and start to play them out, you'll see that they really fall nicely into 4 levels, you know, basically in agreement with Smith's previous drawing. If you look at this with the body, mind, spirit, soul, and spirit, into 4 levels very commonly, depending on what tradition you're looking at, you can see a lot of mapping that works quite nicely and interacts. There's a lot of fidelity across these layers, depending on what discipline you're looking at. And I think it behooves us all to kind of know what level we're talking about as well. I think a lot of times what I witness in arguments is people talking about different levels of being, and the leveling that a lot of times discourse, rapid discourse forces, that doesn't get unpacked, and people don't realize they're not actually necessarily disagreeing with each other. They're talking about different phenomena, almost like different frequencies. So when you're working with patients, it's really important to kind of know what their underlying kind of predisposition is. You know, do they tend to merge with symbol, which is considered to be a little bit more of a concrete state, an immature state, where one is trying to kind of take the power of the symbol for one's ego. You know, it's mine. It's a little bit of Gollum and the ring. You know, I own the ring, and it's way too powerful for the ego to own. It's interacted with but not owned. Or is that ego alienated from symbol? Is it so far away that it can't see through the symbol to the light that's beyond, which can be a state of kind of nihilism, where symbols are really all just become signs and they're robbed of their life force, and kind of the mystery is extinguished. What we want is for ego to be separate from, but receptive to symbol, or separate from, but receptive to the self. Again, thinking back to that same drawing. So there's communication between the two, but that they are their own separate entities. And if you look at the life cycle that Edinger describes, this is very, very nicely maps onto the hero's journey. If you like Joseph Campbell, you can go there instead. I do like some of the language in here and the idea of the kind of inflated heroic act and rejection. I won't spend too much time on this. If you want to look a little bit at where I think ketamine can be very useful in working with people within this paradigm. There are certain places where ketamine is maybe not so helpful. I think there is a literature about using ketamine in kind of a manic inflation, or true mania, you know, I won't argue with a research paper necessarily, but I would say that I would be anxious about doing that myself. I don't think I'd feel, you know, wonderfully comfortable about that. Whereas melancholic depression, the kind of wounded, alienated state, is very, very, very often responsive to ketamine for a kind of healing and repair. And I believe it can help people kind of return to wholeness and kind of get out of this stuck chronic space where they are not accepting or finding a way to accept forgiveness from the self, because they're so alienated from the self. So I'm going to give you two examples of some ways that these symbols come out in actual, these were actual sessions that I was working with patients, and I think they're very interesting because they illustrate really quite nicely this ego self axis. This first one was a woman. We were working very, very high EQ, highly sensitive and intelligent woman that has a kind of crushing sense of responsibility, a sense of urgency that everything that she do be proper, and can very much find herself in difficult places, motivated by shame, feeling kind of alienated from her intuitive function. In her ketamine experience, she had this experience of being next to a massive submarine, and she was connected to that submarine with an oxygen tube, and she was in her kind of little exploratory pod, and this submarine was the safe kind of well of safety that had her protected, and it was allowing her through that oxygen tube to go out and explore. And what was very interesting as well for her is that the submarine turned into a very, very beautiful, beautiful and wise kind of opulent, like rich fish that she was able to interact with directly and look in the eye of the fish and touch the fish. And when she touched the fish, she became infused with meaning and this sense of goodness and wellness, a sense of like of being fully at peace and whole. And this fish has become a very important symbol for her, and it's a very nice thing for us when we're discussing about, you know, whether she's in contact with the fish, and as a symbol for the deep self and her wonderful interaction, that kind of infusion that she received in that moment. And then you will also see patients that have this is almost the same drawing. It's kind of quite interesting. You know, we've got this ego self kind of alienated. The symbol is not available. This is a different patient, kind of in some ways similar types of problems. There's some cluster B, a lot of PTSD, complex PTSD, and very, very commonly having to defend deeply from despair that lurks around the corner. And her experience was that she was moving towards a mothership, and the mothership had something extremely special and wonderful to offer to her. And as she was moving towards the ship, the excitement built and built for her. And finally, when she docked with the mothership, she became, again, similar to the other case, infused with this kind of deeper knowledge and kind of belonging. And I would argue, you know, a deep encounter with self and infusion. And in her case, you know, she likes sci-fi and the kind of 2001 metaphors about, you know, about the monoliths and knowledge being given with grace to humans to kind of help them evolve, and that there's somebody watching. These were all really nice themes for her, and they kind of helped her to kind of hold on to that moment. And this is, again, getting, you know, full circle, coming back to how I believe the understanding of these concepts can be very helpful when you're doing therapy with patients in these kinds of circumstances. Because if you can, again, capture that symbolism, capture the symbol, mind the symbol, remind them of the symbol, moving forward, and kind of re-engage with this kind of material, you can help them really hold on to something that they get to keep. And there's no end of material to turn to for these types of transpersonal symbolism. And I find it's actually easier to plug into just existing myth and meaning that people interact, even in pop culture or in history, that's meaningful to them. And you know, you can interact with them in that way and really speak their language. You've got heroes call to action with Noah from the Old Testament, with the Star Wars myth, and just about, you know, everything that's come after it, with Churchill and Lincoln. You have the dangers of expansion. What happens when we grasp for too much power, and that form of power is not necessarily mature enough for us to be able to, or to be able to wield. You've got Achilles, you've got Harry Potter and Voldemort and that interaction. You've got the Frankenstein story, Dark Night of the Soul. Of course, you've got many versions of that. The encounter with the self, lots of different versions. And the idea of the Philosopher's Stone, the idea that when we find the Philosopher's Stone, and Jung felt that that was, again, you know, becoming in contact with the deep self, and gaining the intuitive function in our lives, that we are able to kind of transform even small things into beauty and meaning in our lives. And I think that he was very interested in the practice of alchemy in the Middle Ages, and that as a kind of metaphor for what these you know, conscious humans were trying to work through, trying to find answers to. I think 2001, I think Siddhartha's river, which was always brought what was needed, and it might look like junk, but it's transformed into gold. And then of course you've got mythic transformation everywhere you look. The resolution of paradox specifically can also be a very powerful experience for patients, and it's something I think is worth speaking to directly with patients about what kind of healing power that can have. There's this old alchemical poem, heaven above, heaven below, stars above, stars below. This concept that, wherever you look, the same thing is there. That might seem to be reductive, but it's actually so wonderful and kind of infusing with meaning. It just reinforces the kind of wonderfulness of the mystery. And so a lot of patients will experience that again, this resolution of paradox. And Edinger felt that this was an extremely important aspect of kind of a healing that can happen, wherein the series of psychic contents, the complexes and archetypal images make connection with the ego. And it has actually, in that moment, its most characteristic feature is the encounter of opposites coming together to make a whole. And I think you'll find that symbolism very, very much in your patients when you talk with them, if you are looking for it. And you can help them understand what it is and help them direct them to larger traditions that they can dive into to know more about it. So I'm finished. I wanted to get to all of that material, and I hope I didn't lose everybody on the science side, but I think if you understand that aspect of it, and you can kind of move your way up to understanding why that symbolism, if there's a whole brain kind of gamma singularity that's occurring in a ketamine experience, why that symbolism that emerges from that experience might be so helpful, why that might be something that's really specifically worth trying to capture when you're working with patients. So I thank you.